Lisa, welcome to the Realignment.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Good to see you, Lisa.
So we are here to talk about your book, Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. But a good place to start would be your thoughts on the future. The book came out back in May, I believe, but it's December. This is a reckoning point in some ways if we're thinking about Trump leaving office. Obviously, the industries are really tied to that sort of storyline. So how do you think moving forward, how do you just think about that point of time?
Wow. I mean, get out your crystal ball, right? But in some ways, you can look to history to inform what is going to happen going forward. Now, it is a really distinct moment in time. And will cable news drop off? Doubtful. Will audiences shift? Yes, likely. Mm-hmm. Will there be different sorts of polarization than we've seen? Yes, absolutely. We're already seeing that. But what will happen to CNN specifically, they're going to have to, realign, as is everyone. And my fear is that all media will, because they've been so doggedly in pursuit and watching the Trump show all these years, might drop the ball because they'll be so dazzled by this kind of boring new administration, what seems to be a boring new administration. But who knows? Who knows what really will happen? I think, like I say, history does inform it, but viewing habits, there's a certain half the segment of the population is going to be angry. So somebody's going to cater to that. Who that is and how that pans out is yet to be seen, and will be, I think, influenced by what media develop and the use of media over the coming several years.
Yeah. Lisa, I mean, how would you compare this? Because the book is so good about actually telling like the story of how this 24-hour news thing came to be and it was born, and it really defines, I mean, especially Marshall and I's lives. Like when I think about the inflection points and historical moments, I think about CNN. I think about sitting there as a child, 9/11, sitting there as a child, war in Iraq, President Bush. Like these are burned kind of into my head, along with Barbara Starr, who I actually covered the Pentagon. I remember meeting her. I was like, I watched you as a kid. Like, you're Barbara Starr. Wolf Blitzer. It's the same thing. I met him once. It's a little underwhelming, I'm going to be honest. But, how would you analogize this current inflection point situation to what you write about in your book? Is it like the beginning, given streaming and internet and all that? Like, are we waiting for somebody to come in and recreate the wheel all over again? Like, how do you think about those trends in the industry?
Well, people recreate the wheel as new technologies become available, like how I'm talking to you. Mm-hmm. But how I'm talking to you, the analogy there is, years ago, we would do it by the phone. I mean, when CNN started, it was such a revolution to just have a picture or even a voice of a correspondent in the field from all around the world on the air immediately. So each iteration of the technology allows more razzle dazzle, or even not even razzle dazzle. Now, you'd see a picture of us talking to each other, and there's really nothing remarkable about it at all. It's just a bunch of people sitting around chatting. So each iteration of the technology is just it's just technology. It's how it influences, like you say, how it influences you, what sears into your brain as a young kid turning on the news. It's the access to the news. I just wrote a book that hasn't been published yet about the creation of NPR, and one of NPR's first star anchor people is 76 years old. And she talks about how when she was a little girl during World War II in rural New Mexico, so even if she'd been in a big city, she would have had access to more media, but she had very little access to media. She couldn't even get TV in the early days. Well, this is pre-television, but she would sit and listen to Murrow on the radio with her dad and hear the news reports from the field on the radio, and how dazzling and extraordinary that was. And that informed her decision to go into the media. So I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you're asking, but it's so interesting to hear. I, as a little girl, remember hearing that television hadn't always been around. And when I was a kid growing up in New York, television went off at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and
Right.
there wasn't 24/7 media. So my influences were different, but very much really the same. It's just informed by the delivery system, which I don't know if that's helpful.
No,
No,
it
it
is.
is. Yeah.
And as we get into the present day and the evolution, a good place to start would be 1980s. So a couple immediate questions. Who was Ted Turner? Who is Ted Turner? He's still alive, obviously. But then secondly, the part that I really loved about the book is, in my telling, and I think Sagar will agree, and most of our audience will agree, cable news is the definition of something that isn't sexy. It's not cool. We don't subscribe. If you do subscribe, it's for the sports, and there's sort of an incidental thing there. I watched the debates using YouTube with sort of streaming function. So let's talk about who Ted Turner was in the 80s, why that really matters, but then also what was it about 24-hour news that back then was this cool, innovative thing that really changed the way people saw these things?
Well, 24-hour news just didn't exist. The news cycle actually went to bed every night. The news, people went to bed every night. There was you could maybe tune into some sort of radio and hear all night long, chit chat. But the idea that you would turn on a television and hear news at any time, or be alerted to the idea that there was a news breaking at any time, was remarkable. When Ted Turner started out, he was a billboard salesman in the 70s. He'd inherited his father's company. And billboards, of course, served a certain purpose and were a certain sort of controversial back in their day, but they made him a lot of money, and he decided that wasn't sexy enough, and he got into radio, and that wasn't sexy enough. And then he bought, by almost complete happenstance, he bought into a little UHF channel in Atlanta where he was headquartered, which didn't reach very far. And once he had his hands on this technology, which was not, by our standards right now, remarkable, we could reach more people. We are reaching more people in this forum than he was then, with a television station, which cost quite a lot of money. He was dazzled by the possibilities, mostly from the sales standpoint, not from the content standpoint, because he was an ad salesman. And it was in this march in the 1970s, which a lot of people don't remember or weren't alive for, was a march of technology that's not dissimilar from what we've seen over the last 10 years as podcasting took over the universe and the iPhone took over the universe. And basically, Ted Turner seized this momentum of the 70s where cable was being invented, completely not sexy unless you lived in a rural part of the United States where you had not been able to get a television signal before, like the NPR anchor I was talking about. I mean, that helped enable a whole swath, a huge part of our country to get just basic television signal. And then from there, it married with the invention of the satellite, or the commercial availability of the satellite. Again, sexy if you're an engineer, not so sexy. It's a delivery mechanism, it's a utility, but it was a thrill at that moment in time. And those two things coming together, Ted Turner was paying enough attention. He was also boozing and carousing and racing yachts and living this wild, crazy, fabulous, over the top life. But he was also plugged in enough to see that this marriage of these two technologies had great capability. Now, he didn't care one bit about the news. News was not interesting to him. Sports were interesting to him simply because he was making money selling sports on his channels. But he wanted to deploy this technology. And that was, if he had been alive now, he might have been the guy who came up with TikTok. He was, he wasn't an engineer, but he saw the power of this technology. And that's when he sat around with a bunch of his guys, and they were guys then, and said, what can we do with this that's unprecedented? And that's where they said, let's start a 24-hour news channel. It wasn't that they had any political agenda or any grand ambitions to unite the world at that moment in time. It was simply a story of technological advancement, and they seized the moment, and they were there. You're not old enough to remember. I hate when I say that, but I'm now old enough to remember when I, as a young person in my 20s, would meet people who had their first cell phones. You've probably seen pictures of them. They were bricks, and they cost a fortune. And the minutes, you'd have to be very wealthy to get one, because just to make a phone call to you wherever you were cost a lot of money. And people who bought those cell phone licenses, those cell tower licenses in those early days, got really, really, really rich. And it's again, it's a moment of time that you walk into. People applied for those licenses and didn't even have the money. They just leveraged themselves to buy them. And Ted Turner was in just the catbird seat. He was in this perfect position. He had just enough money. He had just enough gumption. He was just crazy enough to not worry that, this all could collapse on him. And he was visionary enough to see that all of us, because he'd seen it in increments, all of us, human nature, was that we want to watch, and we want to be plugged in, and we want to be tuned in 24 hours. But back to your original question, it is so hard for us to imagine that there was ever a time that you weren't plugged in constantly, that you couldn't find out instantly what was going on. But that was not very long ago.
What's so interesting hearing about this is when your emphasis on the technology is that because they had that, they didn't have as much of an assumption about the content and about how that was all going to work out. And so one thing I know from your book, this is so fascinating to me, is that they were like, we'll place less of an emphasis on the talent. Like the talent won't be the product, and the news will be the product. Like people will tune in for the news. I mean, that is not how cable works today. Like I did cable last night. It's all about the personality, and they're super short bites. And let's be honest, nobody really cares about the news. I've been on during daytime Fox. I'm sure a couple dozen people saw me, and they had me on mute while they were in like a diner or something like that. That's the truth. How did that turn out? Talk about some of the assumptions about talent and news and personalities, and kind of like what they thought it was and what it actually ended up being.
I have one word answer, and then I'll expand on it for your point, your excellent point, and that is competition. When CNN started, there was no competition.
Right.
First of all, there hardly anybody had cable, so really nobody saw it. I think it was 1.2 million people CNN launched, and there were 1.2 million people who could get it. That doesn't mean they tuned in. And there were maybe 18 million homes in the entire United States that had cable when CNN launched in 1980. But to your point, and CNN has played a huge factor in the role in this, is journalism didn't used to be celebrity oriented. Yes, there are people who we know, if you study journalism, you know who Murrow was, you know who Cronkite was. You might know a couple of other names from ancient history, but you probably don't know famous newspaper reporters from the early 20th century. And that's because back then there were very few. It wasn't about creating a brand or celebrity. You didn't have to. You were a person who were out. You were out in the field covering whatever you were covering, dispatching back whatever dispatches you had. And yes, maybe you were notorious for a certain reason at some point, but mostly it was just good journey person, mostly men, journalism. What happened is when CNN started in 1980, the TV news was changing radically in the 70s, partially because of technology and partially because of rules and just changes. I'm trying to shorthand a whole lot of broadcasting.
Complicated history.
Yeah.
Yeah. but TV was changing radically. Everything was changing radically in the 70s. Cultural mores, the women, we'd had civil rights had burbled up in the 60s. Everything was changing. And so when CNN launched in 1980, the news was the star because that's all there was. There wasn't any money to pay $1 zillion to some blockbuster anchor. And there weren't that many blockbuster anchors anyway. And to staff it, just to get it off the ground with the limited budget it had to be not crowdsourced a la TikTok or something, but it had to just be engineered by young people mostly who didn't know or care about making big bucks. They needed a job and they wanted a petri dish to work in, and there weren't any other alternatives. You couldn't start your own show in your basement without a lot of hassle, and then no one would probably see it. So people came to CNN, and CNN's ethos was the news was the star. And in fact, if you look at the pictures of the people who were on the air then, they were not, people in general weren't glamorous because they weren't engineered the way they are now with the white teeth and the Botox and all of that. But it's kind of startling when you watch television, because I don't own a TV, and I see how every single person has those teeth. It's like, I know those people don't all have those teeth, but they're all engineered. Well, that didn't exist in 1980. And so the news was the issue. Now, they still had the same problem, which was, okay, there isn't something happening every 24 and every second to fill 24 hours. So they had to scramble. And that's also what's interesting too. And it's really hard for us to remember that, and you were not around for this, that every single godforsaken press conference or briefing or, be it from a disaster site or something in Washington. I mean, Washington was a complete and utter time-filling boondoggle for CNN because there's constantly a press conference. Content. But no one had ever parked a camera in the back of the room and rolled on the thing live and transmitted it live before, because that's kind of boring. It was kind of boring. So it just did not exist. So this is I wrote a book about Bhutan years ago, and it was the same sort of conversation. It's so mind-blowing to imagine that there's a country that existed in the 20th century that didn't have roads. It didn't have roads. It didn't have hard currency. It wasn't electrified. It's the same sort of conversation.
They were happy, though. That's their thing.
And they were happy.
Right? That's their thing.
National happiness.
They didn't have to see how their teeth weren't white enough and their clothing wasn't fancy enough. And that's exactly the same conversation with cable news. Right now it's this cutthroat, multi-zillion dollar competition, and it's, I think, in many ways ruined the world while informing it too. But you have to step back 40 years and put yourself in the head of there was nothing else to watch on cable. There was some sports, there were some movies, there were other movies. That was a whole other conversation. MTV came up so you could watch music, which was a wacky, crazy, mind-blowing thing to people. But, then when you're flipping through and you see, and by the way, the remote control didn't always exist either. When you're flipping through and you're seeing these people in a newsroom and there's people running around behind them, or maybe it's just some boring, wonky press conference with some guy dressed in a tie who you don't know, but wow, maybe what's happening? It's live. Let me look at it. Maybe he's going to say something interesting. Oh, not interesting. Click. So that whole world was the perfect analogy. You probably don't remember this, but I remember when texting became a thing. Like people started texting. It was called MMS then. It came over.
We were barely, I think we were barely
we were
there.
right at my Motorola Razr.
Yeah. But so people my age, I'm 57, people my age had to learn the whole idea. My mother, 83, just learned how to text. It's crazy. I'll never talk to her again. She's going to text me forever. But when texting first came in widespread to our, day-to-day universe, people had to learn what that was. And that's what's happened with what CNN did. It taught people how to expect that news would be constantly available, even if there was no news, even if that was just a wonky guy at a press conference.
See, that I think is the most important point. And one thing I'm thinking about, I just want to make this more vivid to people, is like I used to be a White House correspondent. And the first time I ever got to ask a question to the president, I remember standing up and all the cameras pan with you, like at this press conference. And you're like, oh my God, like I'm live before like millions of people. That was the first time it was ever in my head. And I was like, I better not screw this up, And after a while, like you get used to it. But I'll never forget that moment. I mean, it was the first time that I was like, holy shit, millions of people are watching me right now. And it was so crazy. But to your point there about, and by the way, I agree with you. It ruined the briefing room and it ruined journalism in many different, important ways. But that's a different conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about the competition aspect. And I wonder, where do you think the turning point was? Because I kind of see it with Murdoch. I think Murdoch's entry onto the stage and Roger Ailes. I mean, Roger Ailes, he had a lot of problems, but in terms of this, he was a real genius. In terms of my reading on this, is it's not even that he made it entertainment. It was about presenting the news in a way that he knew was going to cater to an unserved audience. And at the moment, what was it, 5 years only after they launched, they're number one. And that creates the incentive structure for MSNBC and CNN to follow. And look at cable today. Who are the highest rated shows? Tucker is the highest rated person on all of cable. Behind him is a bunch of other Fox shows. Then it's Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes. And then even on CNN, people in Washington think of CNN like Jake Tapper, right? Here's the truth. Nobody watches Jake Tapper. He probably gets 400,000 or 500,000 viewers, in his hour. They watch Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo, who nobody in DC actually watches. And I think that is what created that dynamic. I'm just curious if you agree that Murdoch is really the one who started all of this. And I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, there's absolutely no question. CNN had a 15 or 16 year history. They were ramping up as the technology of cable married to satellite was ramping up, as the United States was becoming, the world, but we'll leave them out of this conversation because that's too complicated. But the United States was learning getting wired for cable. When CNN launched, you couldn't get it in DC. You couldn't get it in New York. It was not in major American cities because major American cities were not yet wired for cable because at that point they didn't need to be. So as CNN ramped up from 1980 to the mid 90s, as it was becoming part of this cultural and news, journalistic force, it was doing that in tandem with the United States being wired for cable and with milestone events along the way. I write in the book about the little girl in the well in Texas who fell in, and that put CNN on the map for a lot of people because they wanted to watch and see if the girl got rescued. Before that was the shuttle Challenger. After that, you had the Gulf War. And then in the mid 90s, when Murdoch and Ailes started Fox, that all happened for complex broadcasting reasons, which if you're interested in the history, I'm sure you know this, but listeners, it's such a fascinating moment in time.
The war to get on cable was insane. People do not understand. We're talking about literal analog plugs that go into things, and that getting in that plug in New York is worth $1 billion. Giuliani got involved.
The politicians, and you see this. People should look up John Malone too. There's all these controversies with these big. You're talking to the two nerdiest cable people you run into in the DC space, but there's this crazy body of work about all these sort of things. It's really exciting.
It's nuts.
They were cowboys. They literally, you think about the Wild West and the Gold Rush, and that we talked about that in the early days when I was at the New York Times. We had to say you were not allowed to write the Gold Rush, the Wild West about a story that has to do with the internet. But that's what 20 years before with cable, that's what it was. And it was only people crazy enough, rich enough, or wacky. I mean, they were wacky to go out and mine all of that. But when Murdoch came in and he, enjoyed this relaxation of rules that allowed him to buy different broadcasting channels and that, like I say, whole other thing,
right.
All of that. When Murdoch and Ailes came in, that forced CNN's game. Because CNN up until that point could afford to just have some, really good anchor person from Kansas City who they hired, who was so thrilled to be working on the national stage. And that person didn't have to be branded into a star, and they just had to be good. I worked at MSNBC. I was hired from the New York Times at MSNBC in the late 90s to be the on-air internet correspondent. And
that was a hot job. That was cool. That must have pre.com bust. That must have been huge.
You would have thought so, but it wasn't.
Really?
Because the man who ran MSNBC thought that the internet was bullshit.
So can I ask a quick
How do
question
you run
about that?
Microsoft's network? And you
Well, yeah.
think
So Sagar, that's the key thing that people probably don't know.
Oh yeah, that's
As
true.
I understand it, the MS is Microsoft. You know, if it's, and also people, this is also related. Slate.com was also a Microsoft creation.
All right,
So let's talk about this. How was that possible? They didn't think the internet was serious.
Well, Slate wasn't, I don't think Slate, I have to go back in the memory bank. Slate wasn't a Microsoft creation. It got acquired by that. But MSNBC.
Oh, it was the first web magazine. That's what it was.
It was a first, and well, no, I think Salon might,
Or maybe I don't know.
but yeah, I have to go back in time. But yeah, MSNBC was a fascinating and revolutionary concept in response to CNN and Fox, and CNN, Fox doing their thing, and Microsoft and NBC are like, oh crap, what are we going to do? We have to do something now. So which is, again, in every sort of technological boom, that's what happens. There's the innovation person or company. And then there are all the Me Too, sorry, not that Me Too, but the me, like, I want to do that too. I have some skin in this game, so I want to get in on it. So Microsoft and NBC got together and they created what was supposed to be this. I was not only the internet correspondent, I was the first person who was both on the air, but I also wrote a column for the website, which, like, right now, every single person does that. Every single person works multi-platform. But back then, that was so crazy and revolutionary. And I was one of the only idiots who would do it because, it was seen as such a strange concept. You were either on TV or you were a writer. You would never be both. We even tried to launch, my producer there tried to launch what now you would call a podcast, because we had so much extra content. But anyway, when nobody called it content then either. But it was it should have been an exciting job covering that space, as I had for the New York Times for the web. But because the NBC part and the MS part were at odds and they were split, they weren't united. They were not. They was not one line item and one pool of money that paid everybody. They were at odds with each other. And the guy I worked for at the Microsoft side, the website side, was much more visionary, but had less power than the guy who ran the cable side, who decided to make me like the Vanna White of cable. So during the hanging Chad elections of 2000, I was the jerk who had to go on the Ollie North, Paul Begala show every night and say, oh, Ollie and Paul, today we got this email from Joe in Kansas who's angry about this. And I had to read emails. I mean, it was fun because I got my hair done. Oh my God, it was a nightmare. And I'm telling you that very specific example because the whole show was like that. Like, so I became the person, the whole channel, I became the person they would call when a plane crashed somewhere, cable news thrill, there's a plane crash. And I got called in to sit in front of a computer with Brian Williams, who was then the star, and say, Brian, okay, let me show you the map where this plane has just crashed. And I'm going to call up some websites of information where people who may have had family members in this plane crash it was such a missed opportunity. But meanwhile, while that's happening, Fox is going crazy and kicking everybody's ass and becoming Fox and infiltrating the minds of people like my late father, who sat there and watched all the then stars of Fox all day and all night long. And CNN sitting around going, oh crap, wait, just doing the news with these nice people, nice, hardworking journalist people is not going to work. And when people got pushed out of MSNBC and there was a huge cutback at GE from GE, it was GE who owned NBC. Anyway, that's a whole other story. We all would sit around and say, oh crap, what if we get hired by Fox? We'll have to get jobs. I didn't get a job there. I wound up working in public radio after all that. But because I was too old at 40, they would never have given me an on-air job. But there was this that was a wacky moment in time 20 years ago where cable was just mature enough. It was, it was the thing. It was the delivery mechanism. The internet was just bubbling up, and cable was coming into its own. Cable news was coming into its own only because there was competition. What would have happened if no one else had ever come along and started a 24-hour news channel? I have no idea. I mean,
Yeah.
would CNN have imploded? I don't know, because it was expensive to run. It's expensive to run now. Anyway.
But the key thing here, I want to hit a couple of different points because we're obviously right in on this and there's a lot we want to sort of capture here. Let's talk about cable as a medium and how that sort of shaped these things. I want to lead this into somewhere. So for example, I didn't know that the reason why HBO was the boxing thing, because you sort of see it there, that's there because the first things that HBO was able to sort of build an audience around was broadcasting boxing matches live using the satellites instead of having to watch them the next day. So that's just a weird example of how boxing became this really defining moment for them. And then two, and this is another Ted Turner story, Ted Turner owned the Atlanta Braves baseball team. And I wondered why. I'm from Portland, Oregon. My great grandmother watch the Atlanta Braves. And that made no sense to me. This is in the 90s, but the reason why she watched it is because, and correct me if I'm telling this history wrong, the reason why she watched this is because Ted Turner used his ownership of the Braves and the ownership of the cable channels to broadcast it all over the country. So the only way many people were able to even watch their hometown teams was if they were playing the Braves. So that's why they were called America's team. And it's just so fascinating that all these little dynamics were determined by the nature of a cable thing. And to Sagar, your point about, and who owned what license where, and Lisa, this goes to your point about buying the things. But here's where I want to sort of take this in and sort of explain why the HBO story matters. You said earlier, in many ways, cable news has made what we perceive to be the news as worse. This is a very sort of conventional sort of take. We all sort of agree here. But if you look at cable's effect on other mediums, it's been the exact opposite. TV before cable was in many ways terrible and schlocky, undifferentiated. There's a reason why everything in the 60s was Westerns. It wasn't just because that was the most brilliant, interesting art form. It's because that was cheap, it was straightforward, and there were 3 networks. We see HBO, which then gives us Sex and the City and The Sopranos and The Wire, and now, Game of Thrones, RIP. There's all these sort of great things. We then see AMC giving us Mad Men and all these different avenues, aka it made it better. Why did cable make what we see as the news worse? Like, why is the news the only space where people look back in the 60s and 70s and say, man, that was so great. Walter Cronkite, he was America's newsman. He told the truth. Why is the narrative so different in cable news?
Well, first of all, a lot of that in the 70s is romanticizing, but also you're fast forwarding a little bit too fast, because really initially CNN did improve broadcasting in that it busted up the triopoly of the 3 networks who had the lock on broadcasting at that point. Broadcast news. I mean, they had the lock on everything. So when CNN first came along, it forced the networks to rethink and up their game as far as coverage. Shows emerged as a result of CNN's presence on the networks that would not have been there. There were some terrific overnight news programs launched by the networks, the best one being the one with Linda Ellerby on NBC. If you've never seen old pics, she was like Stephen Colbert, but she was a real journalist, not playing a journalist.
Did she do Nickelodeon things?
Yes.
I was wondering why I knew that name. She would do the Nickelodeon specials in the 1990s.
Yes, we all graduate. We can't wait to see what you guys graduate to 20 years from now. I hope I'm still around to watch it. But she graduated from being a network news anchor and being a pioneering network news anchor. Literally, it was called NBC Overnight, and Lloyd Dobbins was her co-host, but she was the star, and a woman being the predominant star was unusual then. And this was all in response to CNN. You would wake up, if you woke up in the middle of the night, it used to be that NBC would be off. Well, now NBC said, we can't afford to be off because cable came along. So we have to have something on overnights. So they did this news show, and she was wry, and I loved her. I wanted to be Linda Ellerby. She wore these big glasses. She didn't look like, dumb blonde. Sorry. I mean, she was just a really interesting, smart, excellent writer. And so Lloyd Dobbins was too. And they were just terrific together. So for a short while there, that's lost to time, network broadcasting and to an extent, local broadcasting changed their tune or upped their game because they saw the CNN thing come along, and they had, and especially in DC, that created a lot of competition that just hadn't existed before, because before the three networks were in cahoots with each other. It's like the pool, right, and you're the pool today, you're the pool tomorrow, and we share everything. And I write about it in the book. Early in CNN's history, when President Reagan was shot, CNN's response to that as a 24-hour network really pushed the broadcasting networks to change how they thought about delivering news. That happened for a while. And then what happened, and it's an inherent problem with broadcasting, is what do you fill the time with? Well, the easiest thing to fill the time with is somebody with a bombastic personality who gets people together, and then you all shout at each other. Because it's not interesting if we're all sitting around kissing each other. Well, that's a whole other kind of.
Right. There's a different market for that.
That's a different market, right? But I mean, if we're sitting around agreeing with each other, that's not so interesting. So that the inherent nature of broadcasting, it's not to diss CNN or diss Fox, or, I mean, there are plenty of reasons to diss them, but it's the inherent nature of filling the time.
Yeah.
Without having a person standing on every, war zone or place in the universe, that diminishes both the quality of what's happening, because it's not just an intelligent conversation that I tune in for at night. It's this ongoing conversation with a march of people yakking away. And it also diminishes the audience's expectations, because, before, if you had to wait till X period of time during the day or once a week, when I knew, Tom Snyder, I don't know if you've watched him at all. He was you have to look up old Tom Snyder on YouTube. He was the greatest talk show host of his time. And it was on late at night on NBC. He'd sit there with a cigarette, hanging out with whomever was on, and they'd have an amazing conversation. A la, the same reason people love Terry Gross, because Terry Gross is well prepared. She's incredibly intelligent. She's well prepared. She's doing 1, maybe 2 interviews a day. Yes, she's had people help her prepare for it, but she's not trying to just fill the time, which is what happens with cable news. So it's an inherent failing of broadcasting that to do really good broadcasting requires a major event. If you go back and look online at the networks during the assassination of President Kennedy, they went on and on and on. I mean, obviously that was a cataclysmic event in society, not just in the United States. And it was an early example of broadcasting. And you can watch these people, the broadcasters and the people they're covering, all emote and respond in real time to this horrific tragedy that's just occurred. That's a big mystery. Nobody knows what happened, what's going to happen. That's a really stellar example. I mean, it's a horrible example, but it's a stellar example of broadcasting and broadcasters rising to this occasion. And yet at the same time, you still hear you hear very little pontification, because it was all informed by old school journalism, which I know is a big controversy, especially among people of your generation. What is journalism? What is old school journalism? But in this day of old school journalism, I mean, the idea that you even saw Walter Cronkite break down was so remarkable, and it was so reflective of what was happening. So I have to say that CNN changed broadcasting. Broadcasting in general inherently has sort of self-imploded, and it's not any one place's fault, but it's, in the hands of the people it's in the hands of, all of them, all 3 of them. And more of them too, because now they're the ones that just exist in other platforms. They're all in the hands of those voices, and the whole idea of injecting a point of view was a bit of evil genius that completely eradicated conventional journalism and forced CNN and MSNBC to do to do the same, because there was no way they could compete unless they did do the same.
And let's speak more about competition, because as we're thinking about the critique of cable news today as a force that divides and inflames, part of that's, once again, the market economics driving the dynamic, in the sense that if you're competing, if it's just CNN could be the most ecumenical news station of all time. Their market is anyone who wants to watch news at any time during the day. But when you have MSNBC is competing in sort of the more upscale market. I think a funny fact is, didn't they sort of festoon their sets to look like coffee shops sort of at the start? So they were sort of trying to like make them look a little different. But then if you're then having Fox, then there's another market there too. So now today we're seeing it bifurcate even more. You're seeing conservative networks attack Fox for not being, I'm trying to put this lightly, for not admitting a very basic fact about who won the election a few weeks ago. But now you have Newsmax and One America News. So it just seems that like cable is forcing things in a nicher direction where there will be no ability to have any sort of shared narrative. Can you sort of just speak about that dynamic?
Look, I wrote a book before this book about, well, it wasn't really about the creation of McDonald's, but it wound up being a lot about the creation of McDonald's, because I was.
You have written the most fascinating book.
Well, yeah, can you tell us the book? What was the book?
I love you guys. We have to hang out more. This book was called Ray and Joan, the man who made the McDonald's fortune and the woman who gave it all away. And I couldn't sell the book when it was just about Joan, because nobody, as much as everybody loves women and women are so great, nobody would buy the book when it was just about Joan Kroc, who was the greatest and under-recognized and craziest philanthropist of her. I mean, she was so interesting. She wasn't just sitting around writing checks. She was doing crazy, fabulous stuff. I wrote this whole book about her. But to write that book, I had to write about how she got the fortune in the first place from her husband, who worked, he didn't start McDonald's. He worked with these two guys in the desert.
The Founder.
Yeah, you watch The Founder, which is, there's so much wrong in The Founder. Don't get me started. My God, so much is, these boat movies freak me out because there's so much wrong. But so basically, and we were only able to sell the book because that movie was coming out. But I'm bringing up, not to pimp my book about Ray and Joan, because I want to, because it is such a great book. I hope people read it. And it is about this moment in time in 20th century history in the United States where fast food was starting. The McDonald's brothers didn't invent hamburgers. They didn't invent fast food. They came up with the system. They got together with Ray Kroc, who was selling milkshake machines and paper cups, and he got together with them and he helped propagate their system around the nation and ultimately around the world. And it grew and grew. And I won't tell that story, but the reason I bring it up is it's the exact same thing as cable television, cable news. Ted Turner, strange moment in time, married to technologies. He sees this moment. He got this thing up and running. It almost didn't happen, which is the big part of the story that I write in the book, that it almost didn't happen. So many things went wrong. Finally, it got up. People are like, what the hell is this? Why the hell do we need this? Who the hell wants it? What's cable television? Oh my God, everybody now all of a sudden goes from what's cable television to I can't live without cable television. And all of a sudden the vultures are swarming. Everybody wants a piece of the action. Fox comes in, MSNBC comes in, everything changes. Same thing with the McDonald's, same thing with the hamburgers. We didn't just start out eating. There was a time when we didn't eat food on the road. We didn't eat out. Most people couldn't afford to eat out. So if you look at the march of how we as a culture in this country got indoctrinated into eating out and eating food made quickly to go, which is, to me, really fascinating. If you parallel that with how we got addicted to listening and watching media, cable television in this case, it's exactly the same thing, really. I mean, and it really is, if you look at any industry, except the phone industry, because they've always been a monopoly. Well, even that, if you look at later phone industry, if you look at it, all these 20th century technological revolutions, they're all they're all basically the same. One guy comes up with an idea, another guy says, I want a piece of that. They innovate, they force some sort of, cataclysm that
Right.
makes it change. And I'm repeating myself now, sorry. But yeah, I think it's fascinating.
Well, it's funny, before we were talking about just about how that filling time and how much damage that did. I want our listeners to take that away, because this is why I hate cable. I'm thinking back, when I was younger, and I was obsessed with getting on TV, so I would take any phone call. So it's like 11:30 at night, Fox producer calls me. She's like, "Hey, can you come on all night to sit there as a standby guest? Because Trump got these like North Korean hostages released." And obviously, I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." So I'm like sitting in this green room, and like you're just sitting on the set there, and you literally just have live pictures ahead of you. And as you said, the true innovation is people want to see those North Korean hostages walk off the plane, but nobody knows when the hell it's going to happen.
Right.
So you have to fill 3 hours, 3.5 hours, 3:30 in the a.m. till they walk off the damn plane. So I'm like sitting there with this guy, and we're just riffing about North Korea and planes and all stuff. And I realized truly in that moment, I'm like, all I'm doing here is filling time. I'm not here to add value. I mean, you are in a way, but like you're only there in order to make this extra moments profitable, interesting for the viewer, so they stay for the commercial break.
Yes.
But the fascinating part to me is that I think the success of my show Rising is that we basically disaggregated that because of new technology, right? So what we have now is an intentional 1.5 hour show. I think this is all podcasting, right? Which is that you have an intentional show, which is you curated, airs at the same time of the day, doesn't have to fill time, doesn't have to be in there between the commercial breaks or comment on breaking news or whatever.
Well, quick thing, Sauter.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, just real quick.
Yeah.
But this is and Lisa, I'd like you to comment on this part of the dynamic, which is that the reason why most shows aren't on YouTube is that one business model is much better from the other business model.
Yeah, it doesn't make as much more money.
Right, because that's what we're not really talking about, because what's brilliant about the cable model, what people mistake when they say, oh, CNN only gets 1.2 million viewers.
Make a lot of money.
They sell cable. They're a huge part of the cable bundle. People probably wouldn't subscribe to cable if there wasn't the news there in the first place, and they sell the advertising. So that's just the point I'd add to that.
No, you're 100% correct too, which is it can be a shitty medium and still make a lot of money. And so you can have a better medium and a better thing and not even make 1/100th of the amount of money. But I think the industry is probably trending more in that direction. So that's my curiosity with you, which is that what in the cord cutting era do you see as the future, not even the future of news, but the future of like information consumption? Because that's what news was, right? It wasn't actually about Washington. It was about information consumption. Obviously the iPhone, all of that. But we're moving forward, YouTube, Instagram, and all of that. I see that something is coming. I just don't know where it's going to go.
Well, and if you do, call me up and I'll come work for you. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. Okay.
So when I started working in the 80s, and even when I was, studying and all that, even before I started working, the big conversation was, is news what you need to know or news what you want to know?
Yeah.
So there was a big, hue and cry in the 80s with newspapers, as newspapers were starting to realize, this broadcasting thing is whacking us out. People aren't reading us as much as they're watching TV. And the question was, do newspapers, again, I'm looking at the United States lens, do we keep printing international news? Because most people really don't care. So there was this big debate about what news, whose job it was to say who the news was. If I wanted to read international news, well, I could maybe listen to the BBC or subscribe to The Economist, but most people didn't want that. So we'll start easing it out of the newspaper. So I say that in answer to your question. I think, what different people want, what we expect now is that we can choose what we get to see. Before, 20 years ago, I had to pay for cable if I wanted to get X or Y or Z. And along with that came all these other things, and I'll suck it up and I have to take it. I don't really want it, but I have to take it because I want these things. Now we're in such an a la carte universe. I think that that's only going to get more so. But I don't really know, because I do know that the more, AT&T has the power it has always had, even when they've busted up the monopoly, they still always, what is it, like a snail whose head you chop off, they grows back and they come back bigger than ever. That's what happens with AT&T, with these big companies, and they always figure out a way to aggregate everything. All the tech companies are aggregating. Salesforce just bought, what's it called? Slack. And, everybody's always aggregating and trying to figure out a way to make we, the consumer, beholden to package deals that are more beneficial for them than they are for us as consumers. So how that all plays out, what that looks like down the road, when I see my 10-year-old neighbor every day out at the community pool, and I'm thinking, okay, what is this kid? This kid's world is obviously so different than mine. What happens to her? What is she going to grow up? Her parents are in their 30s and they sit around and watch YouTube videos. They don't sit around and watch network TV.
Yeah.
So what is it? How is it going to play out? I think we don't know the specifics yet, obviously, because we don't know what the companies are, the technologies are. People, your peers are inventing this stuff. You're going to invent this stuff in the coming years. So I think in the end, what matters is that what we know for sure is that people want to be connected and they want to be informed and they want to express. And how that plays out, especially now that we won't have a president, presumably, who tweets, who is as engaged in social media. I don't think this new team is going to be as engaged.
Not even close.
I mean, I hope not, because it's just Twitter. We haven't even talked about how Twitter's ruined the universe, because Twitter has ruined the universe. It's ruined civility and all of that. But yeah, so I haven't got a clue.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think if we did sit down and kept talking and laid out all of the technological milestones of the last 100 and something years, still photography, recorded music, and its impact, we could maybe hazard a guess, but I'm not sure. Am I even answering what you're asking?
No, I think that's
no, you are. Which is, where is it going to come from? Yeah.
And a good final question for me here is, once again, we're all shouting out the book here, but what I like how you did is it's very much tied to these personalities. It's Daniel Shore, it's Ted Turner, we're talking about Rupert Murdoch here. So as we're sitting in the year 2020 going to 2021, hopefully we'll have a better 2021. Where do you think these personalities, where are they going to be drawn to from an opportunity perspective? So are the sort of Ted Turners and Rupert Murdochs and Daniel Shores of today, are they going to be trying to work in big media? Are they trying to create their own podcasts that they run independently? Obviously, Joe Rogan, up until his Spotify deal, was an interesting case study because you had someone who is capable of building an audience that rivaled that of mainstream networks, yet he was doing it independently. Obviously, he still owns his stuff and licenses his stuff to Spotify, but that was sort of a counterpoint to the idea that media would decentralize and these big players couldn't do it. And then another relevant thing, and I'm not sure this is going to happen, but there's talk of Jeff Bezos himself wanting to buy CNN. So where do you just sort of, there's 15 different shows we could do here. Maybe we'll do like an original series or something. But the broad point sort of is, if you think of these personalities, where do you think they are looking at? Less what they are going to do, where are they focused in right now?
Well, look, haven't we just seen all these people get gobbled up by the New York Times, do their podcasts and their, I have a podcast and a column. Right. Yeah. And we have this conversation, or we've had these conversations when Napster came along, when the whole digital music revolution, I covered that a ton at the New York Times, was, oh my God, is name famous rock group, well, the Who, from then. Will the Who?
It was Nirvana, right? They hated it.
Yeah, Nirvana. Yeah, will they ditch their record company and go direct to consumer, or will they stay? Well, okay, what they do is interesting, of course, but more interesting is how does the new talent get developed? We have the same conversation in publishing. You know, one more person says to me, will you self-publish books? I was like, well, if I was famous, I might self-publish books. But if I want to make a living right now, and I don't make much of one, I have to sell my books to a publisher, because books don't, you know, the economic model doesn't work out if I'm just peddling books myself. Now, maybe I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe I should write some romance novels. but
You want to make real money.
Yeah. I want to at least make a couple bucks. But so the whole idea is that the famous people, and this is what's so upsetting, is that the famous people can go out and either start a podcast and then get gobbled up by a company that gets gobbled up by another company that you know cuts them in on the deal, and then there's big money involved. But the startup guy or gal or entity just entering that world has to, you know, either become the Billie Eilish of podcasting, and, you know, do the podcast and hope that somebody picks it up. And so I think the answer to that question is that the celebrity media culture that we've got, sadly, just becomes more so, because we, you know, I can have something interesting to say, but if I'm not a name, look, my boyfriend, husband, I call him, you know, whatever, the guy I live with runs a company called Live Talks LA, where he does these live events with authors and conversation with other people, but they're all name people. And most of them aren't writers per se. And, you know, he'll come home and he'll say, I got Marcus Samuelsson to interview Ziggy Marley. Well, that's a cool conversation you listen to. But if they were just two interesting guys, would you listen to them? I don't know. Yeah. And so I think that this celebrity zeitgeist, I see it, maybe just like I say, because I live with that every day, is just going to become more certain. But yet you see all these people who innovated these podcast companies and grew them to a certain amount, to a certain level, both of income and popularity, audience. And then, you know, they get to a certain point and then they have to sell to get to the next level, because everything's getting rolled up. So it's the same thing all over again. Ted Turner was independent. He was, you know, happily independent and crazily independent, and, you know, deflecting any sort of, you know, outside interest. And then he screwed himself by trying to buy CBS, and he got leverage in CBS and MGM, and he needed to take in partners. And that started rolling up the cable industry and changing everything. So I think, you know, even the people who want to be independent ultimately hit a wall, unless, you know, the Howard Sterns of the universe, different animal.
But he's not even independent, because that's
he sold the series.
He isn't anymore, right? But he was able to name his price and leave terrestrial radio in a way that was groundbreaking when he did it, because he said goodbye to the old-fashioned medium. And of course, they were willing to pay him the money to go to satellite radio, because they needed an ornament to, you know, get. And Spotify's in the same exact position that Sirius and XM were. Now they're Sirius XM. I mean, it's just the same. It's just the story just gets told over and over again. Who's the famous person in 5 years who gets picked up by Bezos's, you know, monolithic megalopolis, whatever he's going to create, you know, with the Washington Post and everything.
I want people to really internalize what you just said, because I get a lot of people who reach out and they're like, I want to be like what you guys do. Like, I want to do that. And so what they say is, and they look at all of these incredible tools for creators, Substack, all that other stuff, right? Twitter. And they're like, I don't need to go mainstream media. Like, I don't need to go get like a normal job. Like, I'm just going to start out on there. And I'm like, no, dude, you can't actually. Like, because I'm like, what you actually have to do is you need to go get an internship at somewhere established, and you need to make a name for yourself. And then after you've got a platform, then you can try to start and begin to scale that up through the connections that you have in the industry, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a fun story. Nobody wants to hear that, but it's true.
When there are 2 million podcasts, because that's once again the problem.
Well, and that's the thing. You hear the story of the Billie Eilish in her back room recording with her brother, and she becomes famous, and you assume that, well, I'm talented, I'll do that too. Do you guys know, you're not old enough, and I'm not even old enough, but I know this from my dad, the Schraff's drugstore counter story?
No.
Okay, well, I'll tell you and your audience this now because you should all know it. In the old days, back when Hollywood, the golden age of Hollywood, if a starlet, usually it was a starlet, not a guy, sitting on a drugstore counter, and some agent walked in and said, "Oh, you are beautiful. I'm going to sign you to a deal in the movies." I mean, okay, so people would hear about these stories, which happened rarely, and flock to Los Angeles because they wanted to be the next discovery from the Schraff's drugstore counter.
Yeah.
They wanted to go to this place where they knew that all these Hollywood big guys would come in and hope to get discovered. So now in a digital age, I can maybe get discovered from my messy little den because, I might put something on YouTube that some Hollywood guy is going to see me doing and think, "Oh yeah, let's sign her." But the likelihood of that is about the same or less as getting struck by lightning.
Yeah.
So, but those mythologies, or the self-published person who puts out a book for $1 on Amazon
Twilight,
and it takes off, and then all of a sudden you're 60 Shades of Grey or whatever that thing is called. Like she did that. She self-published and it got picked up and it became this whole industry. But that is so unusual. It's so unusual.
Yeah, I just, like I said, I have to underscore that because again, it's like, they look at all the work. It took 10 years to get here or whatever. And I'm like, you got to put the 10 years in. And I know it's not fun. And look, maybe it'll take 5, but you got to do it. At least for now, that's just the way that things are going to go. Lisa, this has been such an incredible episode. I want to make sure that people know about the book, Up All Night. They can find it on Amazon. What's your social media, other books, etc. that people should check out?
Sure. My website, lisanapoli.com. I'm at Lisa Napoli all over the place. And also I've got a new book coming in April called Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki, The Extraordinary Stories of the Founding Mothers of NPR. So yeah, but please look for Ray and Joan because I love that book and I'm so proud of that book.
Well, I'm going to pick it up.
Yeah, I'll come back
right after this.
We'll talk about.
You got to come back to talk about NPR. So done.
I love it. No, that's a really interesting 70s story. The civil rights, the women's rights movements twinned together at the creation of public radio. So we'll step back even a little bit further in time. And it's so interesting about Marshall's grandmother and TBS. That's fascinating. I love that story. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.